congratulations on your new post. And
Sorry.
no problem. Congratulations on your new post as poet laureate.
Oh,
And
thank you.
I'm excited to be a part of this conversation. It's funny what happens with poetry and the poet. I had not been feeling well the past couple of days, and up until this reading today, I said, "Oh, I hope my body feels well enough." And lo and behold, 15, 20 minutes before the reading, something just kicks in. So thank you, all of you, for being here, for ushering me into this space. I really want to start the conversation with, um, about pledges, right? We're at the point where I think in this country, we're always looking for an opportunity to assimilate, to be a part of a certain group. And that seems to change with the times. And I keep thinking about what doesn't change, in our country, what doesn't change in our regular interactions with each other. And there's these underlying themes throughout American Scapegoat that you can't really tell. If I don't name names, you can't really tell what era we're in because they seem to be a constant with us. And I think in writing this collection, um, I really wanted to talk about some of those things to allow us to have conversations about them. American Scapegoat starts out with a poem about pledges of all things and the lengths that one is willing to commit and to pledge to prove their allegiance to a particular group or to prove their loyalty. And whether or not that group is political or religious in nature, in America, it is always about both in some way, some shape or form. And I think when you recite even the Pledge of Allegiance, you're saying one nation under God. Like group unity, it's one nation, so we speak as one. And under God, well, we're supposed to all be under that same, um, you know, head of state and head of, spirituality as well, right? But the word indivisible comes after that, right? And yes, we get into, with liberty and justice for all. But when we get into this indivisible portion of it, we get into the conversation about what happens when we disagree with each other. And what happens to this discomfort that we feel when we disagree with each other. And I think we should disagree. We should be able to disagree with each other and we should be able to feel uncomfortable and at the same time, still get along. We don't have to agree on everything. But I think there's something that happens when that divide crosses over that line, when it leads to separation, when it leads to a completely divisive nature of things. And I wanted to start with, asking a lot of questions. So in this book, I really go into some of the poems go through the Black experience. So I address them through Black lenses because I wanted to have a much different conversation. But when we talk about the scapegoat itself in America, it is hard to figure out who the real scapegoat is. We think we know who it is. And we think we know which group, has the scapegoat, which group has been scapegoated. But like everything else I mentioned, it changes with time and it changes with the era. And I can't think of a better poem to start with tonight than the first poem in the book, which is titled American Scapegoat. American Scapegoat. It started with a rouse. A yes meant death, a no meant death of a different kind. One yes meant a death we're familiar with, another meant possibility of only dying once. Once we promised we'll be willing to trill, they wanted more, wanted loyalty, wanted more than lock, stock, and barrel devotion. They wanted ancestral secession, allegiance. Secession by word is not secession by heart. Some say, so we said yes, but guns were never a way for us to make a way out of no way. As a way of making an example of us, a harsh and public afterlife awaited. Every single day, derided of our dignity for refusing to take an oath that breaks an oath. Now, what does it mean to be humiliated for not taking an oath that breaks an original oath? And we go back to the original oath, that is the promise of America. And I think when we talk about that, in many ways, in many circles. America champions itself as the blue ribbon, country of the immigrant story, right? If we go all the way back to that. Because this nation was built and forged by immigrants. And if we're actually going to argue whether or not that was the case, when we take a look at who was here before America became a nation, right? And so then you have a group of people that were displaced. They were already here, but they were made to be refugees in their own ancestral land. So when we talk about what it means to be new in a place and to own it and to have that narrative be the dominant narrative, how can we champion ourselves as, a country founded by immigrants when it doesn't seem like we like immigrants as much? Now, this might be a hyperbolic statement by nature of, everything that we see or hear, but at the same time, that's not the case by everything that we see and hear. Being Haitian born, Haiti is always in the news. Seems like Haiti is always in the news. And when there's a crisis in Haiti, there's always some law or some governor that's ready to push Haitians back into the water. Yet that's not the case for a lot of immigrant, or in this case, not immigrant, refugee situations. And so we start to think about what it means to be both immigrant and Black in this country, and having a type of legislation that feels like it puts you in a very specific category, one that I happen to inhabit. And I happen both immigrant and both being, immigrant and Black. And I keep thinking about what that means and what it means for us to feel like we're a part of a system, we're part of a community. And I don't think any poem, depicts that more than a poem in the book titled Voyager, in which I talk about what it's like to have this unique category that you're placed in, that you can't seem to figure out where you belong. And it's hard to have that conversation. And I'm extremely grateful that poetry allows me to have such a conversation. The poem titled Voyager. You are a speck, azure and dust, in a galaxy called potential. Potential to bust in that what have you done for me lately, Milky Way. Weight of the weight says stop caring before the world does, and that you're not going to amount to anything worth remembering. Like a rogue planet, immigrant and Black, second born, brother of your father's son, a speck through the lands of ephemeral gazes and constant stares. You master constellations like mazes, their eyes rolling blue planets and others filled with oceans in awe of the possibilities, galaxies light years away, while at home cities become oceans and Black moons become dust. And every day something threatens to launch you into the interstellar space of your very own body. There's the idea that when we don't feel at home, the body becomes the place that we go to. That was the case for my book, where I addressed when my body was a clenched fist. I talk about when we experience trauma, that oftentimes the body harbors all of this trauma because it has nowhere else to go. And eventually the body starts to fight itself, or everything we harbor in it becomes toxic to the body. And so what we see as a lot of ailments to the body, whether it be physical or psychological, a lot of it has to do with what we harbor. And I think when we experience marginalizations in those, this kind of fashion, right? You find a place, or you just try to find a place where you can call it home. And it's one thing to go in there yourself, but it's another when the entire world is pushing you back into your very own body. Then it says, well, I don't have a choice in doing that. And where is home for me? What is a safe place? And when we talk about that in this country as policy, meaning a lot of these policies are made to push us back into our own selves, to push us back into our circles, unless, as I started out by saying, unless it fits the narrative of, whoever's saying what at that time and whatever group is heralded as the top group, as long as you're not being divisive. And I think when we can have these conversations about, well, what is it like for you? Versus, oh no, America is not a racist country, or America doesn't have these things that happen. More so, why don't you tell me more about your story? Because I don't know it because that's not what I'm seeing or that's not what I'm hearing. And being on this book tour, I recognize that many folks are not exposed to these things unless they're watching the news. And so they literally don't know. And yes, they can search the internet, they can be on social media, but as we all know, that's a very dangerous place to be these days, especially when you can't really tell fact from fiction. And I think when it comes to, using poetry as a vehicle, I think we get the opportunity to present the information in a way that makes sense. And because it is Women's History Month as well, I want to talk about the effects of all of these different things on mothers. I mentioned being thrown back into the space of someone's own body, but I imagine what it's like or what it was like for my mom to watch me walk out the door and what that felt like and what it's like for all these mothers. When Trayvon Martin, that situation happened, I promised myself that I wouldn't write about that situation unless it made sense for me to write about it, because a lot of people had already written about it. But I also had the opportunity to have Trayvon's mom come to college I used to work at, and I was sitting there in the front row, and she says to the crowd, she says, I hate the fact that I have to be here. And that statement just said a lot for me, because she says, I'm not a professional speaker. I'm here because, and then she stated the story of what happened to my son. And it made me think about what it felt like for mothers to go through to that situation of saying goodbye. And I mentioned mothers because it's a very different relationship to be connected physically with an entity, which is something that I think we take for granted, right? But that connection, and then to have that connection severed in the way that it did. And so it made me think about what it was like for my mother to consider how dangerous the world was for me as her Black son. So this is a poem titled Aperture. Accused of flunking a test as if I took it, as if I studied day and night and bombed it. I did not. Results were waiting for me when I came busting out of my mother's womb, her pride and joy, whose pigment she feared there on her breast would habitually test hope's resilience. I am regaining memory every day, cataloging names, dates, and places I was never supposed to travel to on my own without risking rope, branch, and a gullet full of bullets. When I talk about threads, when I talk about the underlying themes of things that are not just historical in the sense that they happened in the past, that they're still happening, they're still current, they just change. It went from ropes and branches, right, to what happened with George Floyd, right, to watch somebody suffocate in real life on TV with cameras, right, people on their phones. Now, one of the most disturbing images from American history is watching people pose in these lynching photos, right? And that's the history of America. And I said, okay, we can talk about how uncomfortable that makes us feel, but to have people pose, as in smiling and wearing their best suits right next to that, that says something. That's more than just, oh, they were just, acting, oh, I don't know, but all the reasons, right, people can come up with, that itself is just, it's beyond the type of conversations that we're willing to have. And what I want to do is recognize that we have to talk about the humanity aspect of things, that we live in a country that is very much in danger of losing its humanity. And we can champion all of our successes and everything else. But when we start seeing people as less than human, when we start to see the woman's body as less than a woman's body, right, as another object, another thing to be possessed, another thing to be legislated, when we start to see people as that, then we start seeing certain groups that continue to be marginalized. And I think when we talk about these categories of being political and being religious and so forth, when we get into law enforcement, we start to talk about what it means to have such conversations. Now, I do want to talk to you about why I write about these difficult situations. I wish I was not writing about them, truthfully. And I actually wrote a poem about that because I had someone walk up to me after a reading. This was years ago, before this book even came out, and they said, don't you ever write, happy poems? I was like, well, what kind of happy poems, And it was a wonderful connection too. Very short, very short woman with a thick Russian accent. She looked like she wanted to hug me. That's what the conversation started off with. She was like, "Yeah, we're right. Happy poems." I said, "Poems about what?" She said, "Well, poems about clowns." I was like, "Oh," and I didn't have the heart to tell her that writing a poem about people who will make a living behind masks is probably not the happiest poem that you would want to write. But I got what she was saying. I got what she was saying because she had to hear about these things that made her feel uncomfortable, and she wanted to feel good. Now, I often say, if my purpose is just to make people feel good, then I think about all the people that these poems are about. If everybody wants to feel good, it means that if we're suffering, there's no place for those voices to come out. No one is talking about those things. So what happens to these people? What happens when you're going through something and no one is talking about it because they're afraid of having tough conversations, right? And so, but I did write a poem that talks about why I write about these poems and why what I would prefer to write about. It's a poem titled American Testimony. I wish I could write about bees and collapsed colonies, and about a young child frolicking through fields of withered posies in search of something whole and tender, with their head held down and crying about the promises of all that is unseen. I wish this could be a verse about extinction and preventing lions and other wildcats from meeting the fate of a rifle's gun, and about how a broken tooth will always remind me of Cecil, the lion whose murder caused a nation to hold his head down and cry. I wish I were writing about a beach whale or a pack of sea lions who mistook the sand for stardust or heavenly grounds, and how a village of strangers nursed and ushered them back to the sea, watching arm in arm, heads down, crying. I wish what is written was about a rare moth that once made a dilapidated shack its home, and how it was spared minutes before demolition, and how it was the man who built the shack that discovered it, and how he held his head down and cried. Instead, I am writing in hope that you will care about my early demise, enough to be moved by how often I find myself on knees and waiting under a dilapidated sun, and how your head is often constantly held down so you don't ever have to see me die. There's something that happens when we turn our heads away. When we know something is happening, the people that are witnessing that see us turning our heads away. And what it says is we don't necessarily care about that. The other people watching who look like the people who are part of that same category are watching and saying, if this is happening to this person, we say nothing. That means that when it's my turn, no one is ever going to say anything. And what we do here is that oath and the pledge that we took is really just words then, right? Because then we're no longer one nation. We're no longer indivisible. We're no longer talking about with justice, right? Liberty and justice for all. It is liberty and justice for some. And so then what that does is it really pushes us beyond the brink of the American dream, which means at some point, something happened to the American dream. And I have two more poems that I'm going to read. And the last one is a much shorter poem, but it's really asking a set of questions, right, about what's next. But this next one is about what it feels like to be in a place where, even though you've lived there, even though you've been here, it still doesn't feel like home. And it's not because you haven't tried, it's because, well, as the poem will illustrate, it has to do with the American dream. It's a poem titled Elegy for the American Dream. When it reads, this could be you, it doesn't mean you. You are not the day of them of advertisements. You are the dead arrayed in time or Pablo Neruda's The Chosen Ones. the butt of jokes and machetes. You are not a feature in the stories. You are the withheld sneeze. You are the closed mouth cough, a cup yawn. You are hearsay. The practical omission of first editions and reports that read, not even byline in this scene of bread and wine. You are an insect, not the target of ads that say, if you believed here, you'd be home now. You are a dog's yelp in the back of a truck, soon to be fairy tale as the ghost of as the Hosanna of hyena ghost. You are at best a funereal hymn, which means your body is a gravesite. The city in which you orbit is a mass grave to which not everyone in this ad is invited. It's kind of odd to say that I'm on my way home and you want to make this your home, but you don't see anything that necessarily reflect that for you, right? This elegy for the American dream reminds me of what just happened to, as part of the women's NCAA. I think it's college out of Utah. You know, they're traveling, living out their dreams of playing basketball. You know, they just want to win a championship, and then, you know, they go to Idaho and something else happens. You know, and that's one of the things I try to stay away from the news headlines a lot these days, because you could be discouraged by a lot of what is in the news headlines. But that was one that popped up. I said, here are these young kids trying to play basketball, you know, and they face racism. And for us to say, oh, racism doesn't happen, but it continues to happen, I think it does us a disservice as a country. And I kind of mentioned, you know, the idea of what does it mean when you don't necessarily see your stories reflected. You don't see people talking about what you're going through. It forces you to ask a very difficult question. And this last poem is a entire poem is a question. And it came about when because I'm the father of two young, beautiful Black boys, intelligent, bright, beautiful, radiant, all those things. And they were having a hard time understanding why the world has so much animosity towards people who look like them. And so that's a question that I cannot answer, because the cause is not my choosing. I didn't have a decision in having all this stuff happen. So I said, why don't I ask the world? Why don't I ask America? Why don't I ask the universe right back these questions? What am I supposed to do? Thank you so much for your attention. And I end with this poem, When Night Fills with Premature Exits. Is there a place where Black men can go to be beautiful? Is there light there, touch? Is there comfort or room to raise their Black sons as anything other than a future asterisk? At risk to be asteroid or rogue planet, but not comet, to be studied with awe and clamor and admired for radial trajectories across a dark sky made of asphalt and moonshine, to be celebed and deemed a magnificent sight. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Enzo.
Thank you.
See the thumbs up from Brian.
Thank you.
Well, I'd like to open it up to questions. Anyone has any questions for Enzo? And I see Maura. Oh, if you want, I guess what's the best way to do this? Go ahead and unmute if you have a question and maybe raise your hand. Oh, I see Muriel.
Oh, yes. Enzo, what is the difference between being a Black man and being ostracized in this society and being a woman and being ostracized? What do you think?
That's a very good question, Miro, because it's one that I meditate on quite often. And I'm known to make...
I mean, this happens in other countries, not only
It
here.
does, correct. And I'm known to make statements that cause people to say, huh? And one of the things I've said is that my experience as a Black man in America, if we take a look at the connections between women in America and Black men in America. We're dealing with bodies here, right? And both bodies are governed, are legislated against. Mm-hmm. So one example that I'll put is the whole idea of I have to get dressed twice before leaving my house. Right? There's the clothes that I wear, and then there's the posture that I wear to make sure that the world knows that I'm safe, that I'm not a threat. It's not something that I do, right? But I'm aware of my body posture. I'm aware of where I walk. I'm aware of the time of day. I'm aware of my connection to people. And if I switch out Black man and I put woman in there, you are aware of what you wear. You are aware of who you're standing next to. You are the time of day and so forth. If we are victimized in any sort of way, one of the first questions is, well, what did they have on? I mean, you had a hoodie on. I mean, there's no way to tell, right? So we always take a look at how society treats the victims, and that gives you a very good, indication about how they feel about such folks, because you get to, oh, well, I mean, she was wearing that clothes, or, well, she was saying it in this way. What was her tone? None of this stuff matters really, right? So we're legislating against, but it's not just like in terms of, political entity, but socially as a society, we've learned to put both women and Black men, in these categories where they have to be aware of their bodies. They have to be aware of what they're saying. Otherwise, something could happen to them. And so then it's a form of control. It's a form of, certainly, if you're Black and woman, you're dealing with the effects. It's a compounded effect of both, right? So I often say that if women and Black men in this country were able to have a much different conversation, a much different scale, we would recognize the similarities that we have. And of course, right now, the top two things that we were talking about during the pandemic were, even towards the pandemic, were the Black Lives Matter aspect, yes, police, shootings, and then we're talking about the overturning of Roe versus Wade, right? And so then we start to say to ourselves, is any of this about what they say it's about? But it's always like, we need to have power over certain bodies. And when you think about women, well, there won't be any us without women, right? And so then if I control that, I have the power, right? And then if I make a scapegoat in terms of who's the biggest threat in this country, and I say it's a Black man, then all of a sudden I can take care of both. I can control one and I can eliminate the other. In which case, those two will never have the type of conversations that we're having now in terms of how our bodies are being legislated every single day.
Interesting.
Thanks, Muriel. Any other comments, questions? Holly?
Yeah, I don't quite know how to say this, but in learning more and more about racism in this country, and about the presidents, the early presidents, and how they were slavers, all of them. It's been very, that's a tough one, I mean, I grew up with all those portraits in the classroom, sitting there, and all those stories about George Washington and everybody. And they were a bunch of slaveholders that owned, hundreds of slaves. So it's just a comment. I mean, that's painful. But, it kind of shaped this whole country that we're in very, very systemically. In terms of our laws, in terms of our mythology, in terms of what we believe and how we behave. It's just a comment.
And I think acknowledging that, Holly, doesn't negate the fact that this country was founded in the way that it was founded, right? Like, it's a tough conversation to have, but it doesn't negate the fact that America still exists as America. And that there are legacies born out of this, right? There are people whose families were, and so I think sometimes there's like this deeply, at least the thought of this deeply embedded indictment. If we acknowledge one thing, then it means that we throw everything else out, right? Or that it means something, you know? And that's why in American Scapegoat, there aren't any words in there that tells you racist. There aren't any words that tells you about what I do is I say, okay, let's take all the labels out. Let me give you the depiction of someone going through something.
Right.
What do you think about this?
Right.
Because I'm appealing to the humanity in everyone, right? And if they say this is messed up, this shouldn't be happening. Now, and then I add, okay, what if this, let's just say that this person is Black now, and this continues to happen. How do you feel now? Right? Because I think when we talk about it in terms of, there are words that are charged words, right? There are words that are volatile in nature. There are words that, you know, as people would like to say, those are fighting words, right? Because as soon as you say it, you know, or don't touch that, you can't touch the 4 or 5. I mean, there were a lot of other things that happened, you know, like in the history of this country as it was being founded, right? And so when we get at the heart of that, acknowledging that does not mean that everything gets thrown away. It just means that we are being honest about our history, and it means that we can do better, right? But if we keep banning books that talk about that because it makes people feel bad,
Right.
right? And I said, well, I mean, it's one thing to feel bad, but it's another to do bad, right? Like, oh, you make me feel bad about doing bad things. No, that's not how it should work. We need to stop doing these bad things. And it's not about, you know, oh, I feel shame, I feel being guilt. It's not a guilt trip of any kind, because if that was the case, I mean, you think about the long history of marginalization in this country, and such groups have continued to be in this country, right? Continue to forge away. And what they're saying is, we want to be able to be free and carefree and to live our lives. But that's not what's happening. So that tells me that history is not history. That is still happening, in that we're separating, we're dividing what we want to accept as American values, and what we even mean by American. Because I think even most folks who are American don't necessarily know what it means to be American, and some may not even fit into the category of American.
Right. And who gets to decide who's American?
Yes.
It just, these poems, your poems, and this conversation brings to mind one of the things that I most admire about you, Enzo, and that is your dedication to literary citizenship. You know, you're using your work to ask these important questions and to challenge our preconceptions of who we are, you know, and what it means to be American. So I really value that in your work. I guess my question is, do I have a question? I think I'm just going to leave it there. But yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, as you were talking about, one of the things that came up was the poem that's in the book, How to Craft an American Scapegoat. And I'm using, you know, literature, literary devices, you know, because that's how things are made in this country. Everything that you know that's come to be is because somebody wrote it down. The laws in this country, of course, are written down, right? That's how they, or else nothing happens. They can talk all they want, all these politicians and promises, right? But until something is written down and made into law, it can't happen. But there were laws written in this country. You know, when I talked to my 10-year-old about how long it took for women to vote in this country, and how long it took for women to even have their own bank account in this country.
Or credit cards.
Or credit card, right? And he's like, what? And I said, well, yeah, you know, and I said, and this is when the country was founded, right? So I talk about rights in that way, in terms of what we do to deny certain individuals' rights, and how that comes to be, right? Well, you have to sell the story first, right? And then you have to take a story that someone is familiar with, and then put a few things in there, right? And this has nothing to do with political affiliation here, right? but "Make America Great Again" is not a new slogan,
Right.
right? It goes back to Reagan, right? And so all of a sudden, it's kind of like, well, how do I tap into that? Right? Well, people are familiar with this, and there was a very specific generation that was being targeted. And then if you go with those stories and you go back to, well, when was it great? And you go way back to when, to when people consider it to be great. The question I always want to ask is, when wasn't it great? Which in itself says, well, I've never really thought about that, but that's the question I want people to answer, right? So in writing, I add more questions in there because I want people to take the time to ask themselves some questions. So that way they can come to their own conclusion about things. Like, I'm not trying to browbeat anything into anyone's minds about what's happening. I'm saying, take a look at this. Did you see this? Did you think about it in this way? And then leave it at that, right? There's a poem in there where I said, I love dogs, and I said, I know a lot of people love dogs. And so at one reading, I said, raise your hand if you ever allow your dog to kiss you on the mouth, and all these people raised their hands. And I said, now I'm about to say is there no judgment? And then I read the poem, right? In which I said, so if we live in a place where someone can actually kiss their dog in the mouth, how hard is it to love me? Right? That's a question that I want an answer to, right? With that same mouth, you can see people spew so much hate, right? And foam comes out their mouth sometimes because they're so, if you ever watch a clip of something, you're like, how did this person get so angry?
Right.
Why? At me? For what reason? When they left the house and they probably had a dog, and before leaving, they kissed that dog in its mouth, say, I'll be back. And so I started to think about the lack of humanity that's involved in that level of hate. And so it's not just racism, it's beyond that. It's beyond, we start seeing people as less than human. It becomes a lot easier, as they say, to discriminate against them, right? Or to silence them if we see them as less than, which is going back to, to Muriel's point. Let's see how much women make versus what men make. And what the reason behind that is. And a lot of folks are not going to feel comfortable in saying, I don't find any reason on paper as to why that's the case. But it's just how it's always been, right? Or that's just how it is. And so when we're afraid to have some conversations because we know they're going to lead to questions for which we already have answers for. It's just that we're not willing to act upon those answers. So we're going to ask different questions.
Yeah. Does anyone have any other questions or comments? I'll just take a moment to read Rosalind Pedler says, Lisa, this is so wonderful. I'm so sorry that I have to leave early. Please tell Enzo thank you for sharing his amazing poetry and incisive perspectives. As the daughter of a first-generation Jamaican-American father and Louisiana-born mother, this spoke to my heart. And then Sarah Kutara says, thank you so much for sharing the poems and the questions. So much to think about. Appreciate the time taken, the perspective, and the poetry. Yeah. So if there are no other questions, let's say thank you to Enzo. And I see that I'll take the time to thank. And I guess what we can do is take a few minutes for if anyone needs a bio break, maybe 5 minutes, and then come back. I'll take a look at people who have indicated that they'd like to read in the comments, and I'll make a list, and then we'll have our open mic. And I'll stay on in case anyone wants to chat. Thank you. Yay, Carolyn. Ah,
I never know how many poems to read, just in case of questions, because I wrote this for conversation's sake, right?
mhm.
And I love the questions that came up today, and and those continue to feed what I end up writing about too.
Yeah.
So that's why I love such connections, and I'm
Mhm.
glad that we've gathered here on a, I almost read the poem about weather.
Mhm.
I was like, I know we've been frustrated spring, but it doesn't feel like spring.
I
So
was
I was
wearing
gonna read that.
mittens yesterday.
It was cold, that like the heat just kept coming
Yeah.
on, and I was just like, nope. And I said,
No.
I'm not gonna succumb to wearing layers. But then eventually I found myself in layers because you can't
Yeah.
escape it. So
Yeah. Yeah.
And so do you have more than one book out, or I think I heard you mention 2 titles?
I do. So When My Body Was a Clenched Fist was a book that came out during the pandemic, came out the summer of 2020. And it dealt with the pathology of traumatic situations, how the body harbors it to the point where the body uh, contorts itself into a fist as a way of protecting itself. And it goes on the notion that um, we often think of a fist as um, as an offensive type of thing, right? Or weapon. But if you have something that you hold dear in your hand, you're holding onto it tight, you hold it like this, and that's also a fist. And I talked about how going through hard situations, I was harboring all this love and sensitivity and care while living in an environment that was trying to turn me into. I think there's a line in the poem I said, to fight monsters, you must yourself become a monster. And I didn't want to become that. Um, and I knew eventually I wanted to be a father. I wanted to have these 2 loving boys. And I was, no matter what it took for me to contort my body into a fist to protect that, I did. And so the book is about that. It's about growing up in Queens, New York, during the Reagan era, actually. During the height of crack epidemic, but also social violence, and doing so at the height of anti-Haitian sentiments as well, and what it felt like to be a somewhat dreamy kind of person in a place where having dreams was a liability. Because people were trying to. So you had to protect it in some ways, but the point of the book is you pay the price anyway, right? Whether or not you succumb to the environment or you try to protect yourself from it. But at the end of the day, it was all worth it, because I am who I am today because I decided to do that. But so it chronicles that experience and the need for us to focus more on mental health, I think, than other types of services for people who experience trauma. I think anytime we watch the news, there should be something at the end of that that says, if you need help, shows have that special episodes, they'll say, oh, this covered a theme about this. If you need, I think that should be a caveat. Before the news, we're going to cover something here that might be traumatic, or after, here's some services, because they pound us with headline after headline, and then they end with a story about a cat, in Waltham, who gave birth to 15 kittens, and it was supposed to feel nice, warm, and fuzzy. I mean, I'm glad for the cat, and those kittens, and we need those, but I think we need to do more than just that. So the book is about that.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, let's see. I took a look at the people who wanted to read, and I have Muriel, Matthew, Peter, Holly, and Brian. So going in the order in which people responded, Muriel, you're up. Would you like to read?
Okay, my poem has to do with voting, because as an immigrant in this country, voting was very important to me. Because when I was able to vote, and I come from Egypt, my father said, "Why do you want to vote?" And I said, "Well, because it's my right." And he said, "All you do is you stand up and there's this guy with a rifle. If you don't vote for the right person, he'll shoot you." So I said, "Well, I'm not voting then." So it took a long time before I voted. So this is my poem. A vote. Today I voted to build a wall of friendship between people regardless of color, gender, or faith. Today I voted to bring peace in this world and fight for the good of humanity. Today I voted to protect the earth from pollution and support climate control. Today, I voted to support research for new and safe energy sources. Today, I voted to protect the sacred land of indigenous people. Today, I voted to protect all endangered species and provide them with a safe habitat. Today, I voted to help the homeless so they can be warm and safe. Today, I voted to make a better world for my grandchildren and all of the children in the world. Today, I voted for my friends, my family, my neighbors, and especially for you and me. That's all. I'm not writing and saying another poem. That says it all.
That was wonderful, Muriel. Thank you so much for reading that and for telling us about how you came to vote. I did not know that, so learned something about you, for which I'm grateful. Next up, we have Matthew.
Hello, can you hear me okay? So today I'd like to read a poem that I wrote recently. I just returned from a trip to Belize, where I learned to scuba dive. But more importantly, I made a lot of friends on that trip. And it's interesting, when you travel alone, you make friends very quickly. And they're kind of ephemeral relationships, because at the end of the trip, then everybody goes home and you wish you had more time with them. So this poem was inspired by an evening out with those friends at the end of the trip. It's called Souvenir. She lit a cigarette and took a drag. "Is this okay?" she asked, daring us to stop her. We had all gathered in an open-air bar to enjoy each other's company one last time before going our separate ways. We told her it was fine, defying her expectations. She turned to me and asked, "Is the smoke blowing in your face?" I told her it was not. "I know you're lying," she said. "You're too nice." We had all met just days earlier and bonded quickly, making it difficult to imagine our soon-to-be lives apart. "Really," she said, "is the smoke blowing in your face?" Again, I told her it was not. She accused me of dishonesty, but she did it with a smile. So instead of being offended, I was amused. More drinks, laughter, photos, hugs, well wishes, and promises to stay in touch. I will remember that smile forever. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm looking forward to hearing more about your trip at some point. Let's see. Okay. Next, Peter, would you like to read?
Okay. This poem is called The Size of It. The size of it. The size of the problem is not as big as an elephant or as small as a mouse. It's how real it seems to you, and if it fits in the house. The size of a shoe is not akin to the length of your leg or the color of your skin. It rather depends on what country you are in. The size in your breasts or their length doesn't matter. It's the size of your breasts that cause the chatter. The size of your love is not easy to see or to feel. I wonder how I can possibly know if it's real. That's it.
Thank you, Peter. Next up, we have Holly.
Thank you. I think this is one of the ways I have tried to deal with the news. Phoenix. In this story, the clouds have a large task. Being ethereal, they are likely to dissolve or condense into rain. Wind sends the clouds racing. The clouds try to gather up what arms the vengeful, what sings spite and greed into uncovered ears. Wind is eager to help the clouds, eager to siphon off the ashes of hate and send them to a remote part of the universe, or, if it will accept them, to a black hole in space. But the black holes are already filled with the refuse of failed civilizations from remote planets too far away for us to visit. And our solar system's recycling too costly for such poisonous cargo that contaminates everything it touches. The clouds and wind refuse to become discouraged. They keep racing together to find where to bury the ashes of hate. When the clouds do condense and release, wind quiets. Soon moisture rises, new clouds are born, then wind returns to its sacred work.
Thank you so much, Holly. And I couldn't help but notice that that was a cloud poem, in addition to everything else.
Yes.
So thank you. Let's see, I have Brian.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Mhm.
This poem is called Quatrain, which it is not. It's been edited a few times. I don't like to edit poems because I like the purity of the moment they were created in, but I was struggling with some Spanish in this poem, so there's been some corrections that have come out, most particularly with soy or estoy, soy being a permanent I am kind of thing, or estoy being more transient. So like soy Brian, Brian, I'll always be Brian. So I'll leave it up to you at the end. Freight train lumbers through the distant countryside. I can hear from here its lonely, mournful call. I grew up next to railroad tracks, so even though I haven't seen one in a long, long time, I still remember what they looked like. The freight trains, lumbering along, flattening the pennies we left as offerings for their diesel-driven gods. What are you doing? Writing poems, shit, and nothing. A worthy pursuit. Motorcycle engine shatters the silence, as well it should. It's a perfect day for it. Breaks my concentration. A life more than half over. What's been left behind has become greater than what still lies ahead. Last night I dreamt in Spanish, awoke with the question still burning fresh in my mind. ¿Qué haces? Politicizing, or so I say. My neighbor speaking Portuguese on the telephone. Una palabra en otra lengua. ¿Qué lenguaje? ¿Qué modismo? ¿Cuántas otras tienes? Sitting out among the brightly painted flowers, still life with shattered existence, broken addictions, 1,000 new beginnings, still more to come. No necesito su permiso para validar mi existencia. Feeling the sun warm the chill from my tired bones, a weary world, it should be blessing enough. The question that still lingers, that won't stop its ceaseless echo until I am forced to answer. ¿Qué haces? Estoy escribiendo poemas. Estoy escribiendo poemas. Estoy escribiendo poemas. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So I guess I'm wondering, is like, have you taken Spanish classes? Like
Yeah.
what brought you to write in Spanish? Oh, I'm sorry, you're muted.
I took 4 years of high school Spanish.
Mhm.
Didn't remember any of it, but then I ran the overnight team for Target for 3 years, and everybody spoke Spanish. So a lot of it came back to me.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for sharing that poem.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, does anyone else have any poems you want to read? Any questions, thoughts? No thoughts? I know it's a it's a work night. I understand. Well, I'm so grateful that all of you are here. Thank you again, Enzo, so much for I told my last reader, Carolyn Oliver, I thanked her for being a soft open. And I definitely felt that you two are my soft open as I am just beginning this journey as Poet Laureate and holding these monthly readings, hosting them. So thank you so much for your generosity and your grace and for being here with us. It really means a lot.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah. And good luck. Oh, actually, I had one more question. So where are you going next on the spring leg of your American Scapegoat tour?
Oh, that's a good question. There was a shift in my calendar. But my next conversation is with the youth out in Bourne, going to Bourne High School in 2 weeks to do a poetry workshop and soft poetry slam with them out there. And figure that's the next wave, right? The next generation. And so really helping them discover their voices and celebrate their voices. And that's part of the workshop. So that way they can, so I'm looking forward to that.
Cool. Well, have fun with that and good luck.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Hopefully we'll see you next month.
Night, everyone.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Lisa. Goodbye.
Bye.